Corporal Peter Novak's fingers trembled as he adjusted the frequency dial on the captured German radio, his makeshift transmitter crackling with dangerous possibility. Outside his cramped Belgian outpost, Luftwaffe bombers were minutes from obliterating an entire Allied hospital convoy, hundreds of wounded men defenseless against the coming onslaught. With nothing but twisted copper wire, a prayer, and fluent German learned from his grandmother's bedtime stories, Peter pressed the transmission key and spoke in the clipped accent of a Wehrmacht officer. The coordinates he gave would change everything, but not in the way the Luftwaffe expected. What happened next remained locked in classified files for 27 years, a ghost story too strange to be believed, too dangerous to be told. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The winter of 1945 had teeth sharper than any Peter Novak had experienced growing up in Pennsylvania. The Belgian countryside lay frozen beneath a gray sky that seemed to press down on the earth itself, as if trying to smother what remained of hope in this final brutal chapter of the war. Peter sat hunched in what had once been a farmhouse kitchen, now reduced to crumbling walls and a ceiling that leaked frigid air through shell holes. The kitchen table where he worked was scarred with burns and gouges, a testament to the building's violent recent history. Peter was 23 years old, though the mirror, when he dared look into one, showed someone far older. His Signal Corps uniform hung looser than it had 6 months ago, and his hands bore the permanent stains and calluses of a man who spent his days wrestling with temperamental radio equipment. Before the war, he had been studying electrical engineering at a small college in Pittsburgh, dreaming of designing broadcast systems for the new television networks everyone said would revolutionize entertainment. Now, his expertise was devoted to keeping communication lines open while artillery fire shook the ground beneath his feet. The radio equipment surrounding him was a chaotic collection of Allied and captured German gear, much of it damaged, all of it held together by Peter's improvisational repairs. Wires snaked across the floor like mechanical vines. Vacuum tubes glowed in mismatched patterns. The air smelled of hot metal, burning insulation, and the bitter coffee that kept him functioning during 18-hour shifts. His official assignment was monitoring German communications and providing intelligence reports up the chain of command, but the reality was far more desperate. Equipment broke constantly, replacement parts never arrived, and Peter had become expert at cannibalizing wrecked gear to keep at least some systems operational. The morning everything changed began like most others. Peter arrived at his station before dawn, breath misting in the cold, as he picked his way through the ruins. His commanding officer, Lieutenant Robert Henderson, had left a note pinned to the door with a bayonet, standard practice when written orders needed to survive the overnight cold. The message was brief, scrawled in Henderson's angular handwriting. German bomber activity had increased dramatically over the past 72 hours. Command needed better intelligence on flight patterns and coordination protocols. Peter's German language skills made him the obvious choice for the assignment. Peter settled into his chair, a rickety thing he had padded with a salvage parachute, and began the tedious process of scanning frequencies. The German military used a complex system of rotating channels and coded phrases, always adapting to counter Allied intelligence efforts. Finding useful chatter required patience, luck, and an intuitive sense for patterns that Peter had developed over months of listening. He worked methodically through the spectrum, his pencil noting frequencies and times with mechanical precision. Around mid-morning, something unusual caught his attention. It was a coordination channel, the kind used by bomber formations to maintain contact with ground control. The transmission quality was excellent, unusually so for German communications at this stage of the war. Their infrastructure was crumbling under constant Allied bombing, yet here was a signal as clear as if it originated from the next room. Peter's pulse quickened. Clear signals meant important operations, the kind that might justify calling Henderson back from his meeting with the battalion commander. He listened intently, transcribing the rapid German dialogue. The voices belonged to multiple operators, their exchanges following standard Luftwaffe protocols for coordinating bomber runs. Call signs, altitude reports, target confirmations, all delivered in the clipped, professional manner of men who had performed these same rituals hundreds of times. Peter's grandmother had taught him German as a child, filling his head with folk songs and fairy tales in the language of her Bavarian childhood. She had died when Peter was 12, but her gift remained, allowing him to navigate the nuances of dialect and military jargon with ease. The bombers were coordinating an attack on what they referred to as target designation Baker 7. Peter didn't recognize the code immediately, but the described coordinates fell somewhere to the northwest, deeper into Allied-controlled territory. He noted everything, building a picture of a substantial operation involving at least 3 squadrons. The Germans were planning something significant, and they were discussing it with remarkable openness, almost as if they believed their communications were completely secure. Peter was halfway through his transcription when his primary transmitter exploded. There was no warning, just a sharp crack like a rifle shot, followed by smoke and the acrid stench of burning electronics. He lunged backward, nearly toppling his chair, as sparks cascaded across the floor. The vacuum tubes had blown simultaneously, a cascade failure that sent shrapnel of hot glass bouncing off the walls. Peter's instinct was to grab the fire extinguisher, but he realized quickly that the damage was already complete. The transmitter was dead, its guts melted into an unrecognizable mass. His hands shook as he assessed the situation. Without a functioning transmitter, he had no way to report what he had learned. The intelligence about the bomber operation was useless if it remained trapped in his notebook. The nearest signal corps station was 8 miles away, across terrain that was under sporadic German artillery fire. By the time he could deliver his information through alternate channels, whatever the Luftwaffe was planning would already be underway. Peter's eyes fell on the German radio equipment he had been collecting from wrecked vehicles and downed aircraft. The collection sat in the corner, a pile of enemy technology that he had been slowly rehabilitating out of pure professional curiosity. Most of it was damaged beyond immediate repair, but there were components that might work if properly assembled. His mind began racing through possibilities, calculating odds and risks with the frantic energy of desperate inspiration. He had never attempted to transmit on German frequencies before. Listening was one thing, passive and relatively safe. Broadcasting was entirely different, a violation of protocols that could have severe consequences if discovered by his own command structure. But the alternative was allowing a bomber operation to proceed unopposed, potentially resulting in significant Allied casualties. The calculation seemed brutally simple when framed that way. Peter began pulling equipment from the pile, working with the manic focus of a man racing against an invisible clock. He selected a German field transmitter that appeared mostly intact, its casing dented, but its core components still functional. Power supply, check. Frequency modulation, check. The transmission key was sticky but operational. He cannibalized parts from his ruined Allied equipment, splicing wires together with quick, practiced movements. The result was a hybrid monstrosity that would have horrified any proper engineer. But Peter wasn't concerned with elegance. He needed function, however temporary. Testing the transmitter was a risk in itself. Any broadcast would be detectable by German monitoring stations, but also by Allied intelligence units who might interpret an unauthorized transmission as enemy activity. Peter decided the German frequency would be safer, less likely to trigger immediate Allied response. He powered up the hybrid system, watching anxiously as the tubes warmed and the meters flickered to life. The equipment hummed with unstable energy, vibrating slightly as electricity flowed through jury-rigged connections. The German bombers were still on frequency, their chatter now focused on final approach procedures. Peter listened carefully, absorbing the rhythms of their communication, the specific phrases and response patterns that marked authentic Luftwaffe transmissions. His grandmother's voice echoed in his memory, correcting his pronunciation, teaching him the subtle differences between Bavarian and Prussian inflections. He would need to sound perfect, completely convincing, or the entire gambit would fail catastrophically. His plan crystallized as he listened. The bombers were receiving bearing corrections from ground control, periodic updates that guided them toward their target. If Peter could mimic ground control convincingly enough, he might be able to feed them false coordinates, redirect them away from whatever they intended to strike. It was audacious to the point of absurdity, but absurdity seemed to be the defining characteristic of this entire war. Peter checked his maps, calculating alternative bearings that would take the bombers away from Allied positions. His hands were steadier now, adrenaline and focus pushing aside fear. He adjusted his transmitter to match the exact frequency of the ground control station, then waited for the right moment. Timing would be crucial. He needed to insert himself into the communication flow smoothly, without obvious disruption. The opportunity came when ground control signed off after a routine update. There was a brief pause, a moment of silence on the channel, and Peter seized it. He pressed the transmission key and spoke in his most authoritative German, adopting the clipped Prussian accent common among Wehrmacht officers. Achtung, bomber formation heading 270. This is revised ground guidance. Update your bearing to 315 degrees. Repeat, 315 degrees. Confirm reception. The silence that followed felt eternal. Peter's heart hammered against his ribs. He had just committed an act that fell somewhere between espionage and outright fraud, using enemy equipment to broadcast false orders on an active military channel. If this failed, if the Germans detected the deception, the consequences would extend far beyond his personal court-martial. Then a voice crackled through the receiver, one of the bomber pilots acknowledging the correction. Ground guidance, this is formation leader, confirming bearing change to 315 degrees. Adjusting course now. Peter exhaled slowly, hardly daring to believe it had worked. The bombers were following his instructions, banking away from their original heading. But this was only the beginning. One successful deception didn't guarantee continued success, and he had no idea how long he could maintain the charade before someone questioned the authenticity of his transmissions. Over the next hour, Peter refined his technique, inserting himself into the communication flow with increasing confidence. He fed the bombers a series of corrections that gradually turned them in circles, wasting fuel and time while moving them steadily away from Allied territory. The German pilots never questioned his authority, responding to each instruction with professional efficiency. Their trust in the system, in the reliability of their communication networks, had become a vulnerability that Peter exploited with growing expertise. But as morning turned toward afternoon, the situation evolved in ways Peter hadn't anticipated. His monitoring equipment picked up additional German transmissions, different formations coordinating separate operations. The Luftwaffe was more active than usual, suggesting something significant was underway. Peter expanded his scanning, trying to build a comprehensive picture of German air activity. What he discovered made his blood run cold. The target designation, Baker 7, wasn't a military installation or a supply depot. According to the coordinates being discussed on multiple channels, it was a hospital convoy, a line of ambulances and medical trucks moving wounded soldiers away from the front lines. The convoy was traveling along one of the few roads still passable through the winter mud, completely vulnerable to air attack. If those bombers found their target, hundreds of defenseless wounded men would die. Peter's deception suddenly took on new urgency. It wasn't just about disrupting enemy operations anymore. It was about preventing a massacre. His hands moved across the equipment with renewed purpose, adjusting frequencies to monitor multiple channels simultaneously. He needed to protect that convoy, and he was the only person in position to do it. The next transmission he sent was more aggressive. Using his fake ground control identity, he ordered the bomber formations to hold position, while reconnaissance confirmed target locations. The instruction bought time, keeping the German aircraft circling in place while the convoy continued its movement. But Peter knew the deception couldn't last indefinitely. Eventually, real German ground control would notice the confusion and attempt to reassert command. That moment came sooner than expected. Around 1400 hours, an authentic ground control station began broadcasting urgent messages, trying to contact the bomber formations with updated orders. Peter could hear the frustration in the operator's voice as pilots reported conflicting instructions. The German command structure was beginning to recognize something was wrong. Peter made a split-second decision. Instead of retreating, he escalated. He broadcast again, this time with even greater authority, claiming that enemy radio interference was causing communication problems. He ordered the bomber formations to switch to an emergency frequency, one that he had identified during his monitoring, but that wasn't currently in active use. Several formations complied, effectively removing themselves from the legitimate German command network and placing them entirely under Peter's control. The audacity of it shocked even Peter himself. He was now effectively commanding enemy bomber formations, directing them as if he were an actual Luftwaffe officer. The technical challenges were immense. He had to maintain character, use proper protocols, and make decisions that seemed tactically sound while actually serving Allied interests. Any slip, any hint of fraud, would destroy everything. For the next 2 hours, Peter conducted an elaborate shell game, moving bomber formations around the sky like pieces on a chessboard. He directed them toward false targets, ordered altitude changes that wasted fuel, and manufactured equipment malfunctions that forced planes to return to base. The German pilots followed every instruction, their training and discipline preventing them from questioning orders that came through proper channels. But the most dramatic moment came when Peter identified a particularly dangerous formation that was getting too close to the hospital convoy despite his efforts. This group was led by an experienced commander who had begun expressing doubts about the confused orders. Peter could hear the skepticism in the pilot's voice, the tone of someone who sensed something fundamentally wrong. In desperation, Peter created his most elaborate deception yet. He broadcast an urgent warning about Allied fighters in the area, claiming that a large formation of P-47 Thunderbolts was approaching their position. He provided specific coordinates that placed the fictional fighters directly between the bombers and the hospital convoy. Then he ordered the German formation to take immediate evasive action, directing them toward an area that his maps showed was actually German-held territory. What happened next became the stuff of legend, though it would remain classified for decades. The German bomber formation, following Peter's instructions, entered German-controlled airspace at high speed, flying low to avoid the non-existent Allied fighters. German anti-aircraft batteries on the ground, seeing aircraft approaching rapidly at low altitude, followed their standing orders and opened fire. The bomber formation found itself under attack from its own forces, taking heavy damage from friendly fire. In the chaos, one bomber jettisoned its payload to gain altitude and escape. The bombs fell directly on a German fuel depot, creating a massive explosion that destroyed thousands of gallons of precious aviation fuel. The blast was so large it registered on seismographs 50 miles away. The German bomber formation, now scattered and damaged, radioed frantic messages back to their command, reporting that they had been ambushed by their own anti-aircraft defenses. Peter listened to the chaos unfold with a mixture of horror and grim satisfaction. He hadn't intended to cause such destruction, hadn't planned for German forces to attack themselves so catastrophically. But the result was undeniable. The bomber threat had been eliminated, the hospital convoy had escaped undetected, and German command was now focused on investigating how their own systems had failed so completely. As evening approached, Peter shut down his equipment and sat in the darkening room, processing what he had accomplished. His hands trembled from exhaustion and delayed shock. He had operated a captured enemy radio to broadcast false orders that resulted in German forces attacking themselves. The act was so audacious, so far outside normal military operations, that he struggled to categorize it. Was it brilliance or madness, heroism or recklessness? Lieutenant Henderson arrived just after sunset, picking his way through the ruins with a flashlight. He found Peter sitting motionless at his station, staring at the dead equipment. The lieutenant's first words were practical, asking about the status of the monitoring equipment and whether any critical intelligence had been lost when the transmitter failed. Peter's response was careful, measured. He reported the transmitter failure and explained that he had been unable to send reports through normal channels. He mentioned intercepting German bomber communications, but said the formations had apparently become confused by radio interference and had aborted their operations. It was a sanitized version of events, stripped of the details that might prompt uncomfortable questions. Henderson accepted the report without suspicion. Radio interference was common, German command failures were frequent, and lucky breaks happened occasionally. The lieutenant was more concerned about getting the transmitter repaired than investigating the specific circumstances of why bomber formations had spent the afternoon flying in circles. Over the following days, Peter continued his monitoring work, but he didn't attempt another deception. The captured German equipment sat unused in the corner, a reminder of what had happened. Allied intelligence reports confirmed that a German fuel depot had been destroyed by friendly fire, and that several bomber formations had reported communication failures that led to aborted missions. Nobody connected these events to a Signal Corps corporal working in a ruined Belgian farmhouse. The hospital convoy reached safety without incident, its passengers never knowing how close they had come to annihilation. The wounded soldiers were transferred to field hospitals, treated, and eventually sent home, their survival due in part to a radio operator's desperate gambit. Peter's commanding officers never learned the full truth. The official record showed equipment failures and lucky timing, nothing more. But Peter carried the knowledge with him, a secret that felt heavier with each passing day. He had violated protocols, exceeded his authority, and improvised operations that could have resulted in disaster. That everything had worked out was due as much to fortune as skill. The war in Europe ended 3 months later. Peter returned to Pennsylvania, resumed his studies, and eventually built a career designing communication systems for television networks, exactly as he had dreamed before the war interrupted everything. He married, raised children, and lived a quiet life that gave no hint of what he had accomplished in that frozen Belgian winter. The incident remained classified, buried in military archives that few people accessed and fewer understood. The official explanation for the fuel depot destruction was logged as friendly fire due to communication errors, technically accurate but missing the crucial context. German after-action reports blamed the confusion on Allied electronic warfare, a phantom threat that didn't exist, but provided a convenient explanation for the inexplicable. 27 years passed before the truth emerged. In 1972, military historians researching Signal Corps operations during the war's final months discovered Peter's original reports and began asking questions. The discrepancies were subtle but noticeable. How had bomber formations become so thoroughly confused without Allied aircraft in the area? Why had German communications shown signs of both interference and authentic orders on the same frequencies? The investigation led eventually to Peter, by then 50 years old, and working as an engineering consultant in Philadelphia. When approached by military historians, he initially refused to discuss the events, citing security classifications that he believed were still in effect. But the historians persisted, and eventually Peter agreed to tell his story, filling in the gaps that official records couldn't explain. His testimony revealed an operation so unusual that it didn't fit standard military categories. It wasn't psychological warfare in the traditional sense, wasn't espionage in the usual definition, wasn't sabotage as commonly understood. Instead, it was something unique, an improvised deception that succeeded because it exploited the enemy's trust in their own systems. Military analysts studying the incident decades later identified several factors that made Peter's ghost signal deception possible. First, the Luftwaffe's communication protocols, while sophisticated, assumed that transmissions on their frequencies were authentic. They had no system for verifying the identity of ground control stations, relying instead on frequency security and encrypted codes that Peter had learned to mimic through careful listening. Second, the chaos of the war's final months had degraded German command structures to the point where confusion was expected. Bomber pilots receiving contradictory orders assumed the problem was infrastructure damage or communication interference, not deliberate enemy action. Their training emphasized following orders, not questioning their source. Third, Peter's language skills were exceptional, good enough to fool native speakers under stressful conditions. His grandmother's Bavarian German, combined with his careful study of Luftwaffe communication patterns, allowed him to reproduce the exact tone and phrasing that marked authentic transmissions. But perhaps most important was Peter's understanding of electronic systems. His jury-rigged transmitter shouldn't have worked at all, much less well enough to broadcast convincing signals over military frequencies. His ability to cannibalize parts from incompatible systems, splice together improvised circuits, and maintain stable transmission despite using damaged components demonstrated engineering intuition that went beyond textbook knowledge. When Peter's story was finally declassified and released in edited form, it generated intense interest among military historians and communications specialists. Some viewed it as an early example of electronic warfare tactics that would become standard decades later. Others saw it as a unique occurrence that couldn't be replicated, dependent on specific circumstances that were unlikely to recur. Peter himself was characteristically modest when discussing the incident in his later years. He insisted that luck had played a larger role than skill, that circumstances had simply aligned in ways that made the deception possible. He emphasized the risks involved, noting that his improvised operation could easily have failed catastrophically, resulting in Allied casualties rather than German confusion. But those who studied the incident in detail recognized something more complex than mere luck. Peter's actions represented a form of cognitive warfare, an attack on enemy decision-making that was decades ahead of its time. By infiltrating German communication networks and feeding false information, he had essentially hacked their command structure, turning their own systems against them. The fact that he accomplished this with 1940s technology, using improvised equipment in a battlefield environment, made the achievement all the more remarkable. The strategic impact extended beyond the immediate tactical success. The fuel depot destruction disrupted German air operations for weeks, contributing to Allied air superiority during a critical phase of the war. The psychological impact on German forces was significant as well. The realization that their communication systems could be penetrated and manipulated created paranoia and distrust that degraded operational effectiveness. Perhaps most interesting was how the incident influenced post-war communication security. Allied forces studying the event recognized vulnerabilities in their own systems that were similar to those Peter had exploited. This realization drove development of more robust authentication protocols and encrypted communication systems that became standard in modern military operations. Peter Novak died in 1998 at the age of 76, having lived long enough to see his wartime actions acknowledged and studied. His obituary mentioned his career in television engineering and his wartime service, but the details of the Ghost Signal operation remained obscure, known mainly to historians and military communication specialists. He had never sought recognition for what he had done, viewing it as simply part of his duty, one small contribution to a massive collective effort. The farmhouse where Peter performed his deception no longer exists. It was demolished in the 1950s, replaced by modern construction that erased all traces of its wartime history. No marker commemorates what happened there. No monument explains how one corporal's desperate improvisation saved hundreds of lives and disrupted enemy operations. The ground where Peter sat, hunched over improvised equipment, speaking German into a jury-rigged transmitter, now lies beneath a Belgian subdivision, ordinary and unremarkable. But in military communications, schools, and intelligence agencies around the world, Peter's story is still taught as a case study in adaptive thinking and exploitation of enemy vulnerabilities. The Ghost Signal operation demonstrated principles that remain relevant in modern electronic warfare, showing how technical knowledge, language skills, and tactical audacity could be combined to achieve strategic objectives. The hospital convoy that Peter saved continued its journey, delivered its patients, and disbanded, its members scattered across multiple units. Most of those wounded soldiers never learned how close they had come to death that winter afternoon. They recovered from their injuries, returned home when the war ended, and lived lives that were made possible by a radio operator they would never meet. In the end, Peter Novak's Ghost Signal operation embodied something essential about the nature of warfare and human ingenuity. Faced with impossible odds and limited resources, he created a solution from broken equipment and borrowed language, improvising an operation that official military doctrine hadn't conceived. His success wasn't recorded in battlefield monuments or victory parades, but in the quiet survival of hundreds of soldiers who lived because bombers never found their target. The lessons of that frozen Belgian winter extend beyond military applications. Peter's story illustrates how expertise, creativity, and courage can combine to overcome seemingly insurmountable challenges. It shows how individuals, working alone in desperate circumstances, can influence events far beyond their apparent capacity. And it reminds us that history's most important moments often happen in obscure places, performed by ordinary people who simply did what needed to be done. The Ghost Signal that fooled the Luftwaffe existed for only a few hours, a phantom voice on enemy frequencies that spoke with borrowed authority and false coordinates. But its effects rippled forward through decades, influencing how militaries think about communication security, electronic warfare, and the vulnerabilities inherent in any system that relies on trust. Peter Novak's improvised deception, born of necessity and executed with desperate skill, became a legend, precisely because it seemed impossible, a ghost story that was somehow true.